There's a discomfort many men carry in silence, a feeling that no one truly tells the truth about women. Society swings between blind worship and bitter resentment, but rarely lands on clarity or honesty. In this haze of illusions and emotional extremes, Friedrich Nietzsche chose a different path. He didn't hate women, nor did he idealize them. He simply refused to lie. While most thinkers of his time either dismissed women or placed them on unreachable pedestals, Nietzsche dared to ask, what lies beneath the surface? Not who women pretend to be, but who they truly are when the world isn't watching. Nietzsche believed the relationship between men and women was never built on equality or pure love. It was rooted in instinct, strategy, and survival. What society calls romance, he saw as a delicate mask covering the raw friction between two opposing forces. He didn't see women as fragile or virtuous. He saw them as complex, calculating, and driven by a unique form of power. Not better, not worse, just different. And that difference to him should not be worshipped or feared. It should be understood. Because only by understanding the true dynamics between men and women can we break the cycle of projection, disappointment, and confusion. He observed that men rarely fall in love with women as they are. They fall in love with the idea of women, a carefully constructed fantasy filled with innocence, purity, and emotional salvation. Nietzsche called this romantic idealization a dangerous lie. It's not love. It's self-deception. Because the moment reality surfaces, the man feels betrayed, not by her, but by the illusion he created and expected her to uphold. In Nietzsche's view, men don't want to see women clearly. They want women to be mirrors, reflecting the emotional comfort and identity they crave. And by doing so, they strip women of their agency, reducing them to symbols. This worship, Nietzsche believed, was not admiration. It was fear. Fear of emotional independence. Fear of the woman who doesn't need saving. Fear of a presence that doesn't submit. And to escape that fear, men hide behind flowers, promises, and idealized gestures, calling it love, when in fact, it's cowardice. Nietzsche had no interest in preserving illusions. He was after truth, even when it shattered beautiful stories. He believed that to love a woman, a man had to be brave enough to let go of fantasies and face who she truly is. Not a muse, not a redeemer, but a force, instinctive, strategic, and forged in a world that seldom gave her power directly, yet one she learned to master through other means. If you're tired of the half-truths, if you want to understand what lies behind attraction, beauty, and the invisible games played between the sexes, stay with me. Because once you see women the way Nietzsche did, love, identity, and power will never look the same again. Nietzsche didn't view women as powerless. On the contrary, he saw them as masters of a subtle, often invisible form of strength. While men displayed dominance with noise, aggression, or status, Nietzsche observed that women operated in silence, through emotional influence, through presence, through perception. He believed this wasn't weakness, it was evolution. Denied access to traditional power structures, women adapted. They developed a refined intelligence, not academic, but instinctive. An ability to guide without commanding, to influence without appearing forceful. Men built empires with weapons. Women shaped the men who built them, not by issuing orders, but by steering desire, ego, and ambition. Nietzsche saw this not as manipulation, but as survival. Women had to learn how to make others move without revealing their hand. They became strategists, not on battlefields, but in human relationships. This was not an accusation. It was an observation, an acknowledgement of a different kind of power, harder to detect. harder to resist. He challenged the common idea of his time that women were passive or naive. To him, they were intuitive, aware, and highly capable of psychological navigation. Their influence wasn't loud, it was effective. He admired it. But he also warned that its subtlety made it more dangerous because it operated without detection. The most powerful person in a relationship, he claimed, is often the one who never raises their voice. And women, trained by history to survive through influence rather than force, became experts at shaping outcomes without direct confrontation. To Nietzsche, appearances mattered, not because they were shallow, but because they held power. Women, more than anyone, understood the difference between what is real and what is seen. In a world that judged them by image, they mastered the art of controlling it. Their beauty, grace, and sensitivity weren't accessories. They were tools. Tools crafted in a culture that reduced their worth to visibility. So they learned to control perception, because in that control, they found survival. He didn't see vanity, he saw strategy. Women knew the mask wasn't the face, but they also knew the mask mattered. In mastering the surface, they learned to direct everything beneath it. Nietzsche saw this not as deception, but as brilliance. A mastery of illusion, refined over generations, born not from privilege, but from necessity. And in that necessity, women developed a power no law could grant, and no man could fully understand. Nietzsche didn't see love as a peaceful union. He saw it as a battlefield, where two instincts collide beneath the illusion of romance. In his eyes, men and women were not naturally aligned. They were inherently in tension. They desired each other, yes, but for completely different reasons. And that difference gave birth to conflict disguised as connection. Men, he believed, loved from a place of fantasy. They didn't fall in love with women. They fell in love with the idea of women. With beauty, with sweetness, with the emotional salvation they hoped to find in a feminine presence. Women, on the other hand, loved with sharper instincts. For them, love was rarely about fantasy. It was about preservation, about seeking strength, protection, and advantage in a world that offered them very little otherwise. This wasn't a conscious strategy. It was something deeper, something rooted in biology, culture, and survival. Nietzsche saw this as the true nature of romantic relationships, not as mutual surrender, but as mutual strategy. What disturbed him wasn't that men and women used each other. It was that they both pretended not to. Society, he believed, dressed this struggle in poetry and flowers and called it love. But beneath the softness, he saw a calculation. Two forces shaping and manipulating one another under the guise of affection. And this wasn't about blame. He didn't accuse women, nor did he excuse men. He exposed the lie that love is pure, equal, or free of domination. To him, every relationship was a negotiation of power, and most people were completely unaware of it. They suffered not because they were weak, but because they didn't see the game they were playing. The fantasy of love, in Nietzsche's philosophy, blinded people to the forces truly at work: desire, fear, ego, instinct. And until those forces were acknowledged, love would remain not a sanctuary, but a seductive illusion. He didn't believe in sentimental fairy tales. He believed in truth. And for Nietzsche, the first step to real understanding between men and women was to strip away the fantasy. Only then could something deeper, something more honest, begin to take form. Nietzsche believed that morality was never neutral. It was always a tool, either forged by the weak to protect themselves or by the powerful to justify domination. And when it came to women, he didn't see morality as a philosophical commitment, but as an instinctive adaptation. For him, it wasn't about truth, It was about survival. In a world where brute force had long belonged to men, Nietzsche believed women turned to morality as a form of strategic self-defense. They elevated values like humility, patience, and self-sacrifice, not because these were universal goods, but because they were the only available shields. Society praised these traits not for their inherent virtue, but because they made women more tolerable within a male-dominated world. Morality became a kind of performance, subtle, disarming, and deeply effective. Not an illusion, but a sophisticated form of camouflage, a way to influence without appearing to resist, to dominate without appearing to confront. Nietzsche didn't call this deceit. He called it brilliance, a silent subversion of power structures using the language of virtue. Women, shaped for centuries by dependency, had refined this strategy into an art. They had learned how to moralize weakness, to make what was once a limitation appear as a higher form of life. And society, desperate to preserve its illusions of order, accepted this without question. But Nietzsche was not seduced. He listened closely. When women spoke of justice, he heard calculation. When they invoked morality, he saw strategy. Not because he believed women were malicious, but because he understood that necessity breeds intelligence. And in their silence, in their performance, in their subtle plays of emotion, Nietzsche saw not passivity, but precision. To him, the moral posture was never innocent. It was deliberate, a way to navigate a hostile world without ever seeming to fight, not with weapons, but with principles, not with shouts, but with glances. It was power through softness, influence through suggestion, and Nietzsche, ever faithful to uncomfortable truths, admired it, while warning others not to underestimate it. Nietzsche lived in a time when women were expected to be passive, obedient, and confined to domestic roles. And yet, he sensed the storm on the horizon. He saw the early signs of a shift, women beginning to question, to challenge, to move beyond the roles history had written for them. And he wasn't surprised. He was unsettled. He believed that women's power had never been truly absent, only veiled, subtle, indirect, dressed in gentleness, but no less formidable. He wondered, what happens when that power no longer needs to hide? When women stop needing men for protection, approval, or identity? Nietzsche feared that the rise of the independent woman would shake the foundations of society. Not because he thought women were incapable, on the contrary, but because he believed most men were not prepared. The average man, raised to feel superior by default, would feel deeply threatened by a woman who no longer needed his strength, his income, or his validation. And that threat would not manifest as admiration. It would appear as resentment. This wasn't misogyny. It was foresight. Nietzsche understood that a woman freed from dependency becomes a force of nature. No longer confined to emotional manipulation or moral superiority, she becomes direct, assertive, unapologetic, self-defined. And that kind of woman, he believed, would terrify a world built on comforting illusions. He didn't write this as celebration or condemnation. He wrote it as a warning. The future would not be shaped by balance, but by disruption. The rise of the independent woman would not bring harmony. It would bring conflict, confusion, and a painful redefinition of identity for both sexes. Because when women stop asking for permission, the old world loses control. And for Nietzsche, that was both inevitable and irreversible. Nietzsche did not write about women to insult them. He wrote to strip away illusion. Because for him, truth was sacred, even when it was brutal. Yet many misunderstood his intentions. His philosophy was not rooted in bitterness. It was rooted in clarity. And in that clarity, He saw a possibility that most people were too afraid to imagine. A connection between men and women that wasn't built on control, dependency, or denial, but on something far more difficult and far more real. He believed that most relationships between men and women were built on mutual illusion, each projecting fantasies, each hiding weakness, each trying to win a game without acknowledging they were even playing one. But what happens when both sides drop the masks? When the man stops idealizing and the woman stops manipulating? When neither seeks to dominate through charm or force, but instead meets in full awareness of who they are and what they carry? Nietzsche suggested this was rare, but not impossible. It required the death of sentimentalism, the rejection of inherited roles, and the courage to face each other not as saviors or opponents, but as equals. Equal in power, equal in darkness, equal in potential. Not the same, but equally flawed, equally capable of transcendence. To reach that place, resentment must be left behind. The man must let go of his bitterness toward the woman who no longer needs him. The woman must release her anger toward the man who once confined her. Only then can something deeper emerge. Not a reconciliation of the sexes, but a redefinition of what it means to connect. Nietzsche never promised this would be easy. He knew most people would never get there, but for those who could, for those willing to trade comfort for truth, fantasy for reality, a new kind of relationship could be born. One not built on illusion or fear, but on shared strength. Not domination, but mutual becoming. She doesn't attack, she seduces. Her strength isn't force, it's finesse. She knows how to lower her voice instead of raising it, how to step closer instead of pushing away. Her power lies in being underestimated. Men call her delicate, soft, emotional, but that's her camouflage. She doesn't dominate by storming the gates. She's already inside the palace. She doesn't argue, she influences. She doesn't shout, she implies. And in that implication, in that ambiguity, she wields a control far more lasting than authority. Nietzsche understood this. He saw that the most enduring power isn't declared, it's felt. This isn't about deceit, it's about evolution. For centuries, when denied formal power, women developed informal mastery. They couldn't command armies, but they could command attention. They couldn't legislate laws, but they could manipulate the lawgivers. It wasn't about direct confrontation, it was about persuasion, subtle alignment, the slow bending of another's will until he believed it was his idea all along. Nietzsche saw in this a kind of genius, not loud, not obvious, but deeply rooted in human nature itself. She thrives in ambiguity. She doesn't need to define herself because others will do it for her. Men interpret her silence as mystery, her glances as desire, her detachment as confidence. She doesn't need to prove her value. It's projected onto her. And when men fall, they fall into a narrative they wrote themselves. She just plays her part, not because she's empty, but because she's observant. She learned early that in a world where men want meaning, the best way to gain control is to let them invent it. But the danger isn't in her beauty. It's in her awareness. She sees how easily people can be led, not with commands, but with suggestions, not with truth, but with hope. And when she offers just enough, just a glimpse, just a taste, she doesn't trap you. You walk into the cage willingly. Nietzsche believed this wasn't malice, but instinct. A refined survival strategy in a world that punished directness in women and rewarded indirect influence. And the sharper she became at navigating perception, the more invisible her methods became. In that invisibility lies the power. The man who believes he's in control is the easiest to control. The man who thinks he's the hero is the most blind to the script. And the woman who crafts the illusion so well that even she forgets it's a performance, she becomes untouchable, not because she is beyond reproach, but because everyone wants her to be real. And when people want to believe in you, they'll defend your illusion even after they see through it. Nietzsche didn't condemn her. He warned us. The most dangerous performances are the ones the audience refuses to end. She is not here to be understood. She is here to be admired. Not for who she is, but for how well she plays the part. Her existence is not shaped by essence, but by expectation. She learns to reflect what others desire, not because she lacks substance, but because substance is punished, and so she learns to conceal it. Her emotions are rehearsed, her words are optimized, her presence is a mirror, and the more people project onto her, the more she disappears behind the reflection. Nietzsche called this the tragedy of becoming a symbol. The more one is idolized, the less one is truly seen. What frightens her most isn't loneliness, it's invisibility. And so she floods the world with images, signals, gestures. She must be followed, shared, remembered, because without that, she fears she will cease to exist. But attention is not presence, and applause is not intimacy. And so, the more she is seen, the less she is known. The more she is desired, the less she is trusted. Nietzsche knew this cycle well. The soul that depends on others to feel alive eventually loses the ability to breathe without them. But there's a deeper grief hidden beneath the performance, a longing for authenticity so intense it terrifies her. Real love, quiet love, asks her to remove the costume, to stay when there is no spotlight, to be vulnerable without being adored. And that, more than anything, feels like death. Because when you have built your value around the reaction of others, stillness feels like rejection. And yet, stillness is the only space where love can grow. Not love as performance, but love as presence, as truth. Nietzsche once wrote that only when we let go of the need to be admired can we begin to understand ourselves. And she cannot do this because she was trained, rewarded, and celebrated for being seen, not for being real. But the applause fades, the likes decline, the spotlight shifts, and when it does, what remains? Not her essence, because it was never given the air to develop, only silence and fear, and the haunting echo of a life lived through others' eyes. This is not condemnation. This is sorrow. For the woman who mistook attention for worth, for the man who believed charm meant connection, for the society that rewards performance and punishes authenticity. Nietzsche did not write to shame. He wrote to expose. And what he exposed was not the failure of women, but the failure of the culture that teaches them to be everything but themselves. A culture that tells men to worship masks and fear the truth behind them. And until that illusion breaks, we remain strangers, applauding each other across the stage, but never truly meeting behind the curtain. To truly see a woman, not the mask, not the game, not the projection, but the human beneath, is to dismantle centuries of illusion. It is to face the reality that much of what we call romance is theater. That much of what we call connection is calculation. And this truth, as Nietzsche knew, is too heavy for many to carry. Because it doesn't just challenge our ideas about love, it challenges who we think we are when we love. It forces us to ask, have I ever truly loved someone? Or have I only loved the story I told myself about them? This is why so many relationships fail, not from betrayal, but from revelation. From that moment when the script ends and the person begins. When the illusion shatters and both are left with nothing but themselves. And what's revealed is not always beautiful, because authenticity, unlike performance, is messy, imperfect, awkward. It doesn't sparkle, it trembles, it stutters, it asks for patience, not praise. But only there, beneath the roles, the instincts, the inherited fears, can something real begin to form. Nietzsche understood that love was not the enemy of clarity, but its test. Real love is not blind. It sees everything. It sees the flaws and stays. It sees the wounds and tends to them. It sees the manipulation and names it. And yet it remains, not because it is weak, but because it is strong enough to stand in the truth. But few people want this kind of love. Most prefer the illusion, because it asks nothing of them but participation, because it hurts less when it ends, because it's easier to mourn a fantasy than to be changed by a truth. But if you have come this far, if you have endured the weight of these words, then you already know. Illusion is not enough anymore. You are ready for more than admiration. You are ready for intimacy, for silence that doesn't demand attention, for presence that doesn't seek performance, for the kind of connection that grows slowly, quietly, in the dark, not in the spotlight. A love that doesn't seduce, but sees. A love that doesn't shine, but warms. A love that doesn't impress, but transforms. And perhaps that is the ultimate truth Nietzsche left us with, that behind every projection is a person terrified of being unloved, that beneath the game is a wound, that under the armor is a child longing to be held without needing to earn it. And when we finally dare to look each other in the eye, not as roles, but as souls, we find something that no algorithm, no performance, no applause can give us. Something terrifying, something sacred, something real. In the end, it was never about the woman, or even the man. It was about what both became when they forgot how to be human, when they exchanged truth for theater, vulnerability for validation, when they stopped listening to the quiet voice within and surrendered to the noise of the world outside. That's the tragedy Nietzsche tried to warn us of, not just the illusion between lovers, but the illusion within ourselves. We pretend, we perform, we adapt, until we no longer remember what it felt like to simply be. The woman who lives to be adored is not evil. She is lost, trained by a world that taught her she had to be wanted to be worthy. The man who lives to conquer is not cruel. He is scared, conditioned by a culture that told him domination is safer than tenderness. Both are victims of a game they never chose, but continue to play. Because leaving the stage means risking the silence, and in that silence, all the unspoken pain begins to rise. But that silence is also where healing begins, where masks fall, where real connection grows, not from strategies or seduction, but from stillness, from the courage to be seen without the need to impress, from the strength to stand unguarded, even when the world says that's weakness. This is the love Nietzsche believed might be possible. Not love as fantasy, not love as strategy, but love as revelation. A love that starts not with wanting someone, but with knowing yourself. So now, the choice is yours. You can continue chasing reflections, beautiful, fleeting, hollow. Or you can walk away from the performance and step into the truth. It won't be easy. The crowd may not applaud, but in that truth, you will find something no illusion can offer. Freedom. The freedom to feel, to fail, to forgive, to connect, and to finally love, not as an escape from yourself, but as a return to yourself. If these words struck a chord in your soul, if they made you pause, reflect, or even ache, don't let them fade into the noise. Leave a comment sharing how this message made you feel. Subscribe for more reflections like this. And if you're brave enough, share this video with someone who's still lost in the illusion. Because the world doesn't need more performances. It needs more truth. And maybe, just maybe, that truth starts with you.